the Twitter debate gets us into a bigger set of issues about what we do about perceived threats. And now that the threat is heightened and we're talking about domestic terrorism and right-wing extremists, and now we're even talking about people who were previously within the fold, normal Republican, maybe not normal, but they were Republican senators. And now there's a question of whether or not Republican senators should be seen as legitimate interlocutors, or if we should push them outside and basically say they are persona non grata and we should actually isolate them as much as possible, that they are basically contributing to the fomenting of insurrection or instability or extremism. And that's what you've been reporting on for the New York Times, is this new focus on quote unquote domestic terrorism and this heightened attention that I think a lot of folks on the left and the center left are all trying to shift our attention to this right-wing extremist threat. And I'm fine with that, and I support it with a caveat. And I don't think which is that, and I see this happening every day now, where we're conflating domestic terrorists, right-wing extremists, Trump supporters, Republicans in the Senate. And I think there's a desire to say that this is all a spectrum. Some are explicitly violent, but they're all feeding off of each other, and they're all a danger to American national security. In other words, the vast majority of the 74 million Trump voters are peaceful, obviously. The people who were there at the Capitol are a very, very microscopic portion of the overall number of Trump voters, but they're all on the same spectrum of badness. That's what makes me nervous, because there's only one place you end up with that kind of conversation, which is that anyone who was a Trump voter is under scrutiny. I don't mean scrutiny from domestic law enforcement. I mean scrutiny from we're looking at them and saying they are people who believe in something which is potentially dangerous for our society.
This is a crude analogy, but Muslims after 9/11.
Yes.
So, and I understand the concern. I think one of the reasons, first I'll just talk about one of the reasons why I think we're seeing the phenomenon that you're talking about, and then I'll move backwards. But it's because Donald Trump himself refuses to concede the election. And he continues to say things that are untrue about the results of the election. And so that is fueling every group you just mentioned to different degrees to do different things. But whether it's an elected official who is also continuing to use their position of power in Congress to perpetuate untrue statements about who won the election, whether it's an ardent Trump supporter who continues to believe in conspiracy theories because he refuses to concede the election, or whether it's something more violent and more serious like a domestic terrorist. They're all feeding off of the same source. And so that makes it, I think, very difficult for people to see the spectrum that you rightfully and that law enforcement would say exists. You rightfully say, and that law enforcement rightfully say exists. So, for example, one of the reasons why domestic terrorism has been so thorny in the United States is because we have the First Amendment. So there are things that if you saw in a chat room, foreign actors overseas who are ISIS members saying, there are a lot of tools that you would start using to try to figure out what they're up to that you just can't use against American citizens for making First Amendment protected statements. And
that's the way it should be.
In
my view.
And I'm going to say that I agree with that bright line, and law enforcement generally agrees with that bright line as well. So what you saw with January 6th that was so shocking is you saw a lot of intelligence that was all First Amendment protected free speech, indicating a really dreadful thing could happen. And law enforcement did not analyze that correctly. And so then you have to ask yourself, why didn't law enforcement analyze that correctly? Is it just because it was First Amendment protected free speech? Is it because law enforcement was still at that point working underneath it's part of the executive branch, federal law enforcement, and through the Justice Department. And for them, they were seeing the president's own supporters speaking, and how much of that sort of colors your ability to analyze, whether it's a bias or whether it's just, a shading. And then how much of those people, how much is the assumption around the president's supporters being that they're pro-law enforcement, that they would never hurt a police officer? How did all of these things come together to get us to a situation where we had so much intelligence that was so poorly interpreted that led us to this complete disaster?
So just one thing on that. So when you if we're talking about a Trump voter who who says that he or she believes that the election was stolen and rigged or whatever, I guess my concern is that that's a really bad idea. And I think,
But it's not terrorism.
exactly. And but my concern is that by saying these are we're kind of conflating people who think the election was stolen with right-wing extremists who are potentially violent. And I think we have to make very clear distinctions. And Damir, you've written about this because you made I think the really interesting and I think original argument that when people say the election was stolen from Trump, they're not actually making a factual claim about the election result. They're using that as a way to signify their discontent or opposition to an entrenched elite. So it doesn't really matter who won or who didn't. They're just angry, and this is the most obvious way to communicate their anger.
No, I mean, it's fair. It's just when you put it like that out of context, it sounds like a deeply unsupported claim, which it is.
But you did.
I argued it, and it's like I threw it out there in the spirit of like, here's some shit.
No,
like, look at it.
But I think it's a really.
But all I'm saying is like when you put it like that, there's absolutely no way to prove that. I have no idea what's in these people's heads. Maybe they actually do believe. And again, it comes down on the spectrum question. Some people actually probably believe that the conspiracy as such is real. But I think it's funny is that, I mean, I was going to ask you about that because it's partly when you were talking there, I got that whiff of that other thing. It's like we have to protect the truth because that's the other narrative that's coming out in a lot of this stuff. Is like it's the truth against falsity, and we have to fight falsity. That's why that was that. I saw there was the article. I didn't read it. I think it was in the Times, right? It was someone wrote proposing that Biden appoint a truth czar or something like that.
Really?
Oh yeah, truth czar. I saw that and I deeply chuckled to myself because that's exactly what this sort of thing is. It's like we have to fight falsity, like ignorance.
They're called, usually in most countries, that's the Minister of Information.
And everyone made that joke. And then everyone made that joke. The Ministry of Truth is coming to America. So yeah, I think that is one of those things that's I think also one of the things that ends up becoming the narrative is we on the side of truth and knowledge are fighting the irrational hordes that are coming up against this. And I just think that's like the wrong tool to do this because because ultimately this is politics is what I think that's what my argument boils down to is that like these are political questions and they're perhaps being expressed in a deeply irrational way, but this is a facet of polarization and the nasty place our country's in and not really something that is fought by enlightening people.